and so I had a fantastic time, 2 years writing. It's got 160 chapters. The fourth volume is not yet completed. Chapter 126 is called Newton and Religious Mathematics. And it's a textbook, really, for a bright, undergraduate philosophy seminar class, history of science, history of mathematics, which isn't taught enough. I think if the history of maths was taught in all good secondary schools and undergraduate programs, maths would make a lot more sense to people because it's a fascinating subject, and it deserves to be, respected. The ancient Egyptian goddess of maths, Shishat, is an important goddess, and there is a chapter on ancient Egyptian mathematics. They were very good at it. And there's a chapter on Babylonian mathematics. They were also very good at it. And of course Greek mathematics, there's a whole chapter. So it's a source book, a textbook for, hundreds and hundreds of fascinating research questions and topics. Now, I discovered this week there was a chap in another of these amazing Victorian chaps called Baden-Powell, who lived from 1796 to 1860. And, I thought, this is interesting, who's this? Why haven't I heard of him? And he was a mathematician, and he, as was often the case in those days, he read maths at Oxford, he got a first, and then he trained as a vicar in the Church of England, and he qualified in 1821, and he served a time as a curate at Midhurst in Sussex, which I used to live just down the road from Midhurst at Trotton. And I love that area. And H.G. Wells, by the way, taught in the grammar school at Midhurst. And I thought, well, this is very interesting, this chap. I missed him by a bit over 100 years, but it would have been great to have a conversation with him. He believed both in religion and mathematics and science. So he's somebody that would love this book on the religious principles of mathematics. Now, I discovered even more than that. He became professor of geometry at the University of Oxford, where he taught for about 30 years or more. And he was very interested in the scientific theories of evolution that were going around at that time. It was before Darwin had published, it was before Darwin's work, but Baden-Powell believed that the Book of Nature, which is Francis Bacon's term for it, has a different kind of coding that you have to understand than the Book of God's Word, the Bible, sacred holy scriptures. They need to be read with different mindsets, different types of approaches. They're parallel, but they're not identical. And he worked out that some kind of evolutionary process is going on in nature. And he was very, very similar in his thinking to Darwin, in that they were both uniformitists. They believed that the processes of nature that are going on are pretty much, they've been going on for millions of years. And that's how we can work out and read the Book of Nature. Other people believed in sudden miraculous changes in nature. They felt, as did A.R. Wallace, that no, nature is gradualist in its approach. So he was professor of geometry at the University of Oxford from 1827 to 1860. And you can just imagine the kind of quality of his teaching and conversations if you joined him for supper. He also wrote in theology, and he argued that theology should be rational and scientific. He didn't like the way the Bible is so full of miracles, and he actually wrote a very interesting book, which should be reprinted and studied, called Christianity Without Judaism. He argued, as a Christian, that the Old Testament is a bit of a baggage. It's full of battles, it's full of warfare, it's full of God's demanding miracles, it's full of very ahistorical types of events, and the problem is that it sent humanity down the wrong road. If you take the Old Testament as your mandate, there are problems, he said. And I would tend to agree with him. I think if you take, however, the New Testament, he argues, and you reinterpret it in a more rationalistic way, it could lead to an ethically sane world. Not one based on tribalism, nationalism, and tribal deities fighting battles against other demonic deities, but people believing in common sense, love, compassion, and wisdom, and the extension of Christ's teaching message into our lives, into our everyday world. So anyway, what's interesting, I used to belong to a thing called the Modern Churchmen's Union, which still promotes that kind of rational form of Christianity. Now what's so interesting, I discovered, is this chap was the father of Robert Baden-Powell, who lived from 1857 to 1941 and founded the Boy Scouts movement. We've all heard of that. And poor, young Robert, growing up, would have sat at table with his dad and listened to all this idea about a rational form of ethics and been inspired to found the Boy Scouts to try and inculcate young people with that ethos of caring and concern. And now, fast forward, when I visited Bethlehem back in the 90s, when there was a window of peace and one could do that kind of thing, I went as a spiritual teacher, educator, student, I was finishing my PhD with my then partner. And we had a fantastic visit to Bethlehem. I loved it. It was shocking to see the conditions Palestinians had to live in, and I learned some terrible stories, and I learned about Saeed, a young Palestinian boy whose best friend had been shot to death by an Israeli military guy who'd stopped them both when they were walking in the streets of Bethlehem, their city. And Saeed had his pass, but the other boy had left it at home, didn't have his ID, and the guy shot him dead. Saeed complained, and then he was put in solitary confinement in an Israeli prison for a year or two. This is a young boy, maybe 17 years old, who walked around Bethlehem showing us it and told us the story. Obviously, moved beyond words. And this is why I was inspired to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, and have been running that ever since, to try and see if we can apply some kind of rational, correction of language mistakes, to use Wittgenstein's phrase. I mean, if we could just correct the language we've all been using, then can't we then learn to live in peace? And another person I met in Bethlehem in that visit was the leader of the Boy Scouts of Bethlehem, a Palestinian elder who'd been running the Boy Scouts since the 40s. And it's a true story. He said, gosh, I wish the British had never gone away. We I know it was difficult in those days, but at least we kind of knew people would tell us the truth, and we wouldn't get stopped and shot for not having the right papers. And his keeping the Boy Scouts going was sort of act of faith, really. And there were Christians and Muslims in his Boy Scouts troop, living in harmony in Palestinian culture. They live side by side. So I think Robert Baden-Powell would have been very impressed by this guy flying the flag of that possibility of a world based on reason and truth. And I think the father of Baden-Powell, likewise, would have been very moved. So I wanted to share that because it's been giving me some deep thoughts. I also want to move on because one of the key words that's causing problems in the whole Palestine-Israel conversation, which I've been trying to contribute to for ever since then and before, is the question of Zionism. which to some people is a beautiful word. They love it. It's their mandate. It's, they live and die for it. And then for other people, it's an abysmal word that's caused endless trouble, and it should be a word that should be expunged from the vocabulary of humanity. So what I've been studying and reading is a very interesting book called The Question of Zion by a professor at Birkbeck College, where I used to teach back in the day when I lived in London. She's called Jacqueline Rose. And it's an absolute masterpiece. I recommend it. It's Princeton University Press, still in print. Jacqueline was a friend of my mother, Eileen Daffern, and used to visit and stay in her house in Kemp Town. And I met Jacqueline, way back in the 80s. I've never properly studied her work before. I apologise. She's now helping run the Birkbeck Institute of the Humanities, which is an important academic centre in Bloomsbury, where I used to teach. But her study of Zionism is absolutely fascinating. She's approaching it as an intellectual historian like me, and even as a linguist historian. She's looking at the language of Zionism. She's drawing heavily on Gershom Scholem, the great historian of the Kabbalah, and she's revealing how much underlying the early Zionist generation, people like Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann and Theodor Herzl, was a sort of Kabbalistic approach to history and reality. And they were, they were inspired and enthused by all the centuries of messianic expectation. But they made a conscious decision to mask that aspect of their work and to kind of pretend, no, we're not doing anything mystical, we're just having like a nationhood. We're just going to try and get a bit of land for our nationality. Because of the Holocaust and all the horrors of history, we deserve at least that much. And they masked their spiritual work. Anyway, Jacqueline goes into it in enormous detail. Fascinating stuff one learns. For instance, I didn't know that Sabbatai Zevi, who was the false messiah of 17th century Judaism, who came out as the Messiah and said, I'm the Messiah, to his disciples in Thessalonica and Smyrna, in what is now Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. And some people said, yes, you are. He taught a form of the Kabbalah, he taught a form of esoteric Judaism. He was steeped in it all. And some people, particularly a chap called Nathan of Gaza, tragically from Gaza, right, accepted this guy as the Messiah. And this chap said, what we've got to do is go back and refound the Kingdom of Zion. And so he started the whole Zionist ideal, did Sabbatai Zevi. He didn't get very far. If you know your history, you'll know that he failed. But he started the ball rolling, and apparently it was people that knew Sabbatai Zevi and his mission that persuaded Oliver Cromwell to readmit the Jews into England. They'd been banished for a few centuries. But apparently it was Sabbatai Zevi that, through his disciples, that got Oliver to accept their coming back into England. And in a sense, paradoxically, that did lead eventually to, the Balfour Declaration and the eventual readmission of the Jews to Israel, which was very much sponsored by English imperialism and the Rothschilds and English finance and so on. So, but the point is here, what's so interesting, sorry, what's this? Oh dear, somebody trying to contact me. No, we don't want that, thank you very much. For goodness sake. Oh dear. Sorry. Yes, so where was I? Yes, so Oliver Cromwell, now I would like to see some proper academic studies of that. Jacqueline, because it's a slender book, doesn't have time to go into it. I'd love to trace that in detail. In what way did Sabbatai Zevi's disciples actually meet and persuade Oliver Cromwell? Was he in on this kind of messianic plot? Did he think he was the Messiah? You know, what happened there? What we do know is that Sabbatai Ziva eventually converted to Islam. He said the Ottoman Empire gave him a choice. You can either become a Muslim or I'll kill you, because what you're saying is heretical. Because it's interesting that in Islam, actually Christ is the Messiah. Jesus Christ is accepted as the Messiah by Islam, Orthodox Islam. So, anyway, Sabbatai Ziva accepted the offer of becoming a Muslim and surviving, and he lived, a few years longer. Now, to many people, that was a betrayal, and they hated him, and they turned their backs on him. But others said, no, he's a very crafty Messiah. He's pretending to be a Muslim because, he'll survive, and then he can carry on doing his good works. And they sort of took as their marching orders the idea that you can dissemble your religion and then advance your goals in subterfuge form. I don't really agree with that. I think if we're trying to advance truth, we should be honest about our faiths and be as truthful and non-dissembling. But on the other hand, if somebody comes to you, breaks down the door and says, unless you become X, Y, or Z, I'm going to chop your head off immediately, one might be tempted to become the X, or Y, or Z because, after all, they're just boxes on the table, right? But anyway, what's also interesting, I'm learning from her work, Jacqueline's work, is that the most religious Jews regarded Zionism in the beginning as a heresy because it was a materialist nationalism, because it was saying we are going to build the new Israel, we are going to build Zion. It was a political movement. It didn't talk about God's role in any of this. So they said it's a heresy because only God can re-establish the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Israel, in a way that's worth having. The Zionists may create a sort of state, give it an army, win battles, but that's not doing God's will. So the true religious Jews said of Zionism, it's a heresy and it's dangerous and we shouldn't go anywhere near it. And Jacqueline gives the names of all these people, which is so fascinating. Now their latter-day descendants are still saying this about Zionism. They're still saying, and I think the last year, has given them much more ammunition to say this with even more integrity, that a state that thinks that killing 44,000 people with merciless bombing and cruelty and saying go here and go there and then bombing them when they get there, I mean, that kind of cruelty is terrorism, and it's state terrorism. Well, it's Zionist terrorism, would the religious viewpoint would be. And I think I'm inclined to that perspective on Zionism. The more I study it, the more I think I identify with the authentic Jewish religious perspective, which is that it is a heresy, actually. Okay, so, so what? I mean, the thing is, truth is unpopular and doesn't get promoted, whereas heresies get all the, the publicity these days. And so I think it's time we go back to study actually what Judaism is, and that's why I reached for my Oxford Dictionary of the Jewish Religion, which is a fantastic text put together by Professor Weblowski and Jeffrey Wagoda, who were great scholars of Judaism, and it goes into absolute detail, minutiae, on the whole story, and fascinating stuff. I've taught Judaism as part of my interfaith work at Birkbeck College, actually, where Jacqueline Rose is now herself teaching. And the other day it was Josiah in my Book of the Sages, It was his day a couple of days ago, and I looked him up. And he was the king of Judah between 640 and 609 BC. And what's interesting is Josiah it was who outlawed anything that wasn't like mainstream official Jewish belief. And he also centralized worship in the temple in Jerusalem. He said, no, you can't worship God anywhere apart from the temple in Jerusalem, which he had rebuilt. And it was whilst rebuilding it that his builders and architects found a book in the rubble, a law book, which many people say is the book of Deuteronomy. And it came to light during temple repairs in Josiah's 18th year. Now, it's a very legalistic document which fills you with absolute terror if you don't do everything. And this is the origin of that form of Judaism, which is you have to be absolutely scrupulous in your obedience to the mitzvot, the commandments. And if you don't, God is going to be very angry with you. Well, I think one is entitled to ask was Josiah right in this? I mean, the guy wasn't an academic, he wasn't an intellectual, he didn't know anything about other religions. He was, he's a king of a particular patch of land with a particular history, particular narrative, and he saw the other as a threat. So abolish relations with the other. No, you can't marry Phoenicians or Canaanites or Moabites. They're the devil. He actually was defeated finally in battle by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC. But, the thing is that the Josiahs of history cause a lot of trouble. And I think we have to, we have to repair the damage they call. In a sense, he was an early Zionist, right? Believing that only his God matters. Any kind of interfaith acceptance of Canaanite or other religions is completely, to be rubbed out. It's interesting that during his reign is the time when Greek philosophers like Heraclitus, Thales and Miletus, they were all active. Pythagoras was active and visiting Phoenicia at the time, studying in the Phoenician temples and in Babylon. I come from that more Hellenistic wisdom tradition of philosophy that I talked about in the Hermetic texts. Now, Josiah probably never heard of any of that. He would have just said, no, that's not in our Bible, so that's all heretical. I get twitchy when people start talking about heresy, which seems to be contradicting myself, where on the one hand I'm agreeing that Zionism may be a heresy, but on the other, I'm grumbling when heresy is thrown around as a name. I think to try and reconcile this paradox, I would say that we have to be very careful when we start bandying the name heresy around. And I would always say stop, pause, rethink, study, go to the library, suspend judgment. Because after all, that's what happened to Christ. When Christ appeared 600 years after Josiah and started teaching we'd call it a left-wing liberal form of Judaism. No, the letter isn't as important as the spirit. It's how you feel about what you're doing, it's your motivation for what you're doing. It's your spiritual journey that matters, not the letter of the law. He was accused of heresy by the kind of the faction who'd taken over control of the temple that wanted to convert it into purely rules and regulations types. The Rules and Regs Brigade, who think religion is just about sticking to certain rules that have been set generations before, and because they're in writing you have to do them, rather than submit them to common sense and reason and compassion and the heart in the now. So Christ was coming from that perspective, and he was accused of heresy and killed for it. And if you haven't discovered it, watch The Chosen, which is a very good sort of filmed version of this narrative. And I've just got to the bit where he raises Lazarus from the dead, as reported in St. John's Gospel. And this really annoys the Jerusalem rabbis who say, no, that's not in the rules, you can't do that. And it makes them want to kill him even more. I mean, that I find absolutely bizarre. But it seems to be the case. He was doing healings. He was a charismatic rabbi who had healing powers. He had a tremendous wisdom of heart that he could bring to bear on people. Why should that upset people that are supposedly religious? Shouldn't that be the kind of thing we all want, is to live in a world where the kingdom of God has come, regardless of whether you call yourself Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Druid, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever. If it's a kingdom of, ultimate reality, then don't we all want to partake in that? I believe that's what Christ was trying to say, but it was called a heresy, so he was executed. Well, I think I'm with those kind of heretics. And that's why I resonated with the Christian story, having read the whole thing in detail and studied it in my 20s and read the Gospels and the Apocrypha and all the inner works of the of the church history. It seems to me that message is still important for humanity. That's why we celebrate Christmas. Because it is about going with the heart, going with the spirit, rather than the law, which, as St. Paul said, is the problem. When we go with law, everybody's a sinner, everybody has committed some offence, we all ought to go to prison, And then we become a world in which 3/4 of the people are in prison and the other people are prison wardens and judges and lawyers. I don't want to live in a world like that. I want to live in a world free of sin and free of crime and free of, therefore, punishment and free of prisons. And I think that's what Christ wanted in St. Paul too, and I'm with them. And if wanting a society based on love is heresy, well, bring it on. Let's all be heretics here. And I think if you actually look at the history of Zionism, what the first founders and dreamers, I would go further back than Ben Gurion and co. They were the politicians that came later. The first generation of Zionists wanted to build, a home based on love and on truth and on non-violence. People like Martin Buber and other pioneers. And I think that where Zionism went wrong was when it started to use violence and refused to talk peace to the locals that preceded them. I mean, that's why Einstein refused the presidency of Israel, because he knew it was being based on blood of the Palestinians, and he wouldn't accept that. I would still appeal to my many Hebrew friends and Israeli friends to try and explore dialogue with the Palestinian community intelligently, elect politicians that are sensitive to the needs of all the people of the region. There are many people in Israel who are citizens, who are Palestinians, who are Christians or Muslims, and they're, get a dialogue going where all these views can come forward, but non-violently. I mean, it's a huge, gargantuan task after this year-long, horrendous war that broke out, triggered by violence done by the Palestinians against the Israelis. There are a few question marks about why it was allowed to happen and why Israeli intelligence enabled that. Why Netanyahu didn't see it coming and take steps. Did he in some way let it happen? There should be a commission of inquiry into that. Once his current trial is finished, I believe there should be a commission of inquiry into all that, the causation of the October 7th attacks, which he said, no, never going to happen. Well, he's got to go. It has to happen. And he should be forced to explain under oath what he knew and what he did and what he didn't do. I still think it's not impossible that we can actually get peace here. As chair of the TRC for the Middle East, I still believe it's possible, Because what all sides want, whether it's Christian, Muslim or Jewish, what they really want is to be able to live in peace with each other, being faithful to the narrative of their traditions. And I come back to my point about languages. If you're a faithful Christian and you read your gospel and you read your scriptures, you want to live in peace with people and you want to be able to fulfill the law of righteousness from the heart that Christ taught us, and not to have to fight, kill, torture, bully anyone, but to live, in truth and righteousness according to the Spirit as Christ taught. So that's that. If you're a Muslim, you want the same because that's what the Quran says. I've done my commentary on the Quran. If you don't believe me, study it, read it, listen to it. It's an audio book, soon to be published. I assure you that's what Muhammad did the Quran for. He wants his fellow surrendered people to the Allah of behind history, the absolute. All of us who want to surrender our egos and to find a path to absolute transcendence in the real world, to follow that path of Islam, which means to surrender one's ego. The Quran is a blueprint on how to achieve that. It's full of amazing wisdom and beautiful guidelines. It's a manual on how to get a society in peace. You have the right to self-defense. If somebody bursts into your room and starts attacking you, you have a duty to self-defend and defend your family or whatever. But you never have a right to attack others without pre-warning and pre-provocation. It's ultimately a religion of common sense. So that's what Islam wants. And in Judaism, if you actually go into it, as I've done for many years and talked to many rabbis, they actually want the same thing. They want a society based in peace, because peace is the divine commandment. They want a society based on the following of the metaphysical rules of unity, because God is a divine unity, and that includes everyone, every race, every nation. It's not just Israel first, only, and forever. It's this witness to that unity among all the other nations, which also in their own way witness to that unity. And if you look at the greatest philosophers of Judaism and the different schools of thought, if you study the Kabbalah, if you look at the Karaite traditions and look at the Essenes and so on, over the centuries they've been trying to find desperately a way to live in peace and not to keep being invaded. And so I would like to see and help with a peace treaty that should be signed, because I think the peace of the Middle East will only come as a religious peace treaty. The nationalists have tried, and it's created mayhem and wars. Zionism versus Arab nationalism versus Palestinian nationalism versus Iranian nationalism and so on. No, we can't get peace like that. It has to come as a religious peace, and for that we have to have a peace treaty signed between the responsible leaders of the Islamic community throughout the whole region, the responsible leaders of the Jewish and other Israeli religious leaders in Israel and around the world, and also the responsible and intelligent Christian leaders from the region and further afield. We have to get a peace process going among them. That's what I've been working for, and if you want to get involved and help, and if this resonates with you, please do. It's urgent now. It's important. We can't afford, to go on this way, which is just leading to endless chaos, conflict, and confusion. Okay, right.